This section is called Foundations. So starting with rapid, robust and inclusive development being the first priority in terms of foundations of adaptation strategies and principles. Lead ministry here is imagined to be economy or finance, but always remember that this may depend very much on which country it is and how they define portfolios for ministries. Poverty in terms of income and access to financial and public services is one of the main reasons why countries and people are highly vulnerable to climate change. Together, these factors determine to a large extent how people can manage climate change and the accompanying risks. For example, many smallholder farmers in low income countries have low incomes, few savings and little diversification. This makes them highly vulnerable to losing crops to drought, floods and pests. All of them are getting worse in many places, sometimes together. Their savings are often in livestock, housing and some other material form which can be lost in a natural disaster as well. Many cities in low and middle income countries lack basic infrastructure to cope with climate related risks and provide the services the population needs to manage these risks. So they lack this ability. For example, many informal settlements lack basic drainage infrastructure, have congested and vulnerable road networks, and poor quality housing, leaving inhabitants vulnerable to high temperatures, floods, and landslides. This is often confounded by border issues. So if poor people from one neighboring country are settled into some temporary kind of settled campsites in another country, they often are definitely missing all these basic infrastructure. Many people in LMICs have limited access to healthcare or constrained health coverage, so any disease, whether related to climate stresses or shocks or not, can push them into poverty. Then poverty exacerbates vulnerability to any climate change impacts. With the expected impact of higher temperatures on many water and vector-borne diseases, better access to health care will help reduce social vulnerability. And also the warming changes things like the vapor pressure deficit, where the stomata of the leaves that open tend to lose more water vapor when it's too hot and the atmosphere is thirsty. So this can create various problems in terms of crop yields, crop stress, evapotranspiration, and so on. Looking at another example of taking action, screening questions. Identify actions to lay the foundations for climate resilient societies. I'll read these even though it's a lot of text, because there is some good information there, and as I said before, cramming slides with so much text is not a good idea when you give talks, but since this is a course and I'm reading them, I'm going to leave it as compact as possible. Hopefully it's not a distraction. A strong, robust and inclusive economy can lift everyone and thus increase people's capacity to manage risks and cope with shocks. But in which areas could further progress be made? The following questions can help decision makers identify shortcomings and guide them towards the actions needed to strengthen the foundations of resilient societies. Action F.1 here then, rapid and robust development is the questions you want to ask. Is the economy fulfilling its potential in terms of productivity and economic growth? This always is a key question that often leads to sacrificing climate action, resilience, any long-term goals. Does the macroeconomic system have appropriate buffers against unexpected shocks? There's some dirt on the screen. These could include sustainable public-private debt levels, foreign currency reserves, and so on, which I'm not going to read further. Action F.2, inclusive development. Is economic growth inclusive? Could include growth in income among the bottom 40%, income of the bottom 20%, fraction of population living on less than $2 a day. This is 190 here. So these are questions that should be asked and answered, and implementation of strategies to address these questions are critical. Does it always happen? Obviously, a lot of politics play into it in terms of religious differences, race, ethnic differences, and so on, as to who gets attention, who doesn't get attention from the government even. Are farmers' productivity and income growing? These could include income levels, access to irrigation, hybrid seeds and mineral fertilizers, etc. And then you can ask also, is the country on track to achieve universal access to modern infrastructure services? These could include electrification rates, access to improved water and sanitation. This is still under Action F.2, inclusive development. Is the country on track to achieve universal financial inclusion? Could include progress on increasing access to savings accounts, borrowing, and insurance, protecting the poor, low income, which we looked at a little bit in the introduction and summary. Is the country on track to achieve universal access to health insurance coverage to prevent catastrophic health expenditure? These could include out-of-the-pocket health expenditure, access to basic health care, and so on. There is always the idea that the system is as weak as its weakest link, so if you don't cover the poorest, then them being sick or infected can make the entire population susceptible, as well, as we learned in COVID. Does the country offer widespread social protection coverage? Here you worry about share of population covered by social protection, transfer amount as a share of income, and so on. Is the country actively managing risks in vulnerability hotspots created by conflict or exclusion? So obviously here is what it matters, that one group may just cross over from the border, across the border, and be allowed to stay, but then their living conditions will be very different. These could include number of conflict-related victims per year, existence of peace-building initiative, and so on. So there's a lot, there's immediate action to deal with the crisis, and then there is a long-term strategy to take care of this situation. Action F.1. So here we looked at the kind of the summary under identifying actions and screening questions. But here we go into a little bit more detail. So in each section we'll also see these kind of blurbs on taking action, simple targets, and indicators to see progress. Which will not be straightforward and rapid and monotonic, so you will have ups and downs, but you want to make progress. Average productivity growth, economic growth, debt to GDP ratio, and structural deficits in the fiscal and economic financial systems. Increase economic productivity and growth while keeping buffers for shocks, with leading ministry being economy or finance. The priority for reducing future climate change impacts is rapid and inclusive development and poverty reduction. As a general motherhood statement, this is true. So although all the recommendations in this section aim to ensure consistent and inclusive growth, they are also relevant for climate change adaptation overall. Recommendations to improve economic growth and accelerate development have been widely studied and advocated. So there is a report from IMF in 2014 on that, and they typically include good governance with the right institutions and rule of law, macroeconomic stability and low barriers to entry for new products and firms, to make sure people have the right incentive to invest and create jobs with a conducive business environment, and investment in human capital, including health and education, to ensure everyone can activate their potential and contribute to development and growth. Investment in efficient infrastructure and trade networks to increase productivity and benefit from domestic and international trade. So these are worrying about economic development and growth, but also trying to consider strategies for adaptation to make the society, the country, resilient to climate change impacts. Okay, so maybe I can stop this here, or okay, let's read this one and then finish this podcast. This is Action F.2. Ensure that economic growth is inclusive. We mentioned this, and this lead ministry is again economy or finance. There are often also women's health, social development or rural economies and so on in global south, which may be involved in ensuring that growth is inclusive. So climate change impacts on the poorest people by source. We are looking at people pushed to extreme poverty due to climate change in millions, and here we are looking at pessimistic development scenarios and optimistic development scenarios. So here you are looking at agricultural revenues, labor productivity, food prices, health, and disasters which affect the numbers of people that get pushed into extreme poverty. So you can see that health is a contributor and labor productivity. So health is here, labor productivity is here, and these are the food prices and these are disasters here. This is kind of the pessimistic development which puts the number of people into extreme poverty at 132 million, whereas here in the optimistic scenario you have agricultural revenues, labor productivity, food prices, health again jumps out as a big one, and disasters, which puts the number at 68 million. So obviously investing in health infrastructure, health insurance, tools for dealing with health vulnerability, early warning systems, etc., make it very conducive for ensuring that economic growth indeed is inclusive and poor are not pushed into extreme poverty by health issues associated, loss of labor hours, morbidities that affect productivity, and so on. So the entire system is affected, as well as the poor themselves are affected. So inclusivity is generally shown to be beneficial for all, but when you actually have actions on the ground, it's not always easy to carry the poor along intuitively. So you need special attention to make sure that the economic growth is in fact inclusive. Okay, so we'll leave this podcast here and come back and continue with the foundations in a minute for inclusive growth. Okay.